My mother-in-law forced me to drive in a storm while 7 months pregnant. It was one of those evenings where the sky seemed to close in, dark clouds swirling ominously, promising a night of tempestuous weather. I sat on the couch, my swollen feet propped up on a pillow, absent-mindedly rubbing my 7-month pregnant belly. Jack, my husband, was out of town for a business trip, leaving me alone in our cozy suburban home. The weather forecast warned of a severe storm, and I was planning to spend the evening curled up with a book and a cup of herbal tea. The distant rumble of thunder was already making me anxious, and the baby was unusually active, as if sensing the storm's approach. My phone rang, breaking the quiet. I glanced at the caller ID and sighed. It was Margaret, my mother-in-law. We had a complicated relationship, to put it mildly. I answered, bracing myself for whatever she might need. "Samantha, I need you to come over right now. It's an emergency," Margaret said, her voice as sharp as ever. "Margaret, there's a storm coming. Can it wait until tomorrow?" I asked, hoping she'd understand. "No, it cannot wait. I need you here immediately," she insisted, her tone brooking no argument. Reluctantly, I hauled myself up from the couch, grabbed my car keys, and headed out into the worsening weather. Rain was already pelting down, and the wind howled through the trees. My car, a trusty sedan, felt small and fragile against the elements. The drive to Margaret's house usually took about 15 minutes, but tonight it felt like an eternity. Rain pounded the windshield and the wipers struggled to keep up. I clutched the steering wheel, knuckles white, as I navigated the slick, winding roads. Each flash of lightning illuminated the road ahead, while thunder rolled ominously overhead. Finally, I pulled into Margaret's driveway. The wind nearly ripped the car door from my hand as I stepped out, and I hurried to her front door, already drenched despite the short distance. She opened the door with a scowl, her eyes taking in my soaked appearance with thinly veiled disapproval. "You're late," she snapped. "Margaret, it's a storm out there. What's the emergency?" I asked, trying to keep my frustration in check. "My cat, Mr. Whiskers, has been missing for hours. I need you to help me find him," she replied, her voice wavering slightly. I stared at her in disbelief. She had made me drive through a storm, risking my safety and that of my unborn child, for a missing cat. I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "Margaret, I'm 7 months pregnant. I can't be running around in this weather looking for a cat. Have you checked around the house? Maybe he's just hiding somewhere," I suggested. "I've looked everywhere. I need your help," she insisted, her eyes pleading now. Despite my better judgment, I found myself agreeing to help. We donned raincoats and armed ourselves with flashlights before heading out into the storm. The wind whipped at us, and the rain stung our faces as we called out for Mr. Whiskers. Hours seemed to pass, though it was probably just one. I was exhausted, soaked to the bone, and my back ached from the strain of being on my feet for so long. Margaret seemed oblivious to my discomfort, her focus solely on finding her beloved pet. Just as I was about to suggest calling it a night, I heard a faint meowing coming from a nearby bush. I shone my flashlight towards the sound and saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. It was Mr. Whiskers, looking thoroughly miserable, but otherwise unharmed. "Margaret, I found him!" I called out, relief flooding my voice. She rushed over, scooping up the wet, bedraggled cat and cradling him in her arms. "Oh, Mr. Whiskers, I was so worried about you," she cooed. I stood there, shivering and exhausted, but relieved that the ordeal was over. Margaret looked at me then, really looked at me, and seemed to realize for the first time what she had put me through. "Thank you, Samantha. I'm sorry for making you come out in this weather. I didn't know what else to do," she said quietly. "It's okay, Margaret. I'm just glad Mr. Whiskers is safe," I replied, managing a tired smile. We made our way back to the house, where Margaret insisted on making me a cup of tea to warm up. As I sat there, sipping the hot beverage, I couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, this shared experience would bring us closer together. The storm outside raged on, lightning flashing through the windows and thunder shaking the walls, but inside there was a newfound sense of understanding between us. It wasn't perfect, and I knew it would take time, but it was a start. And for now, That was enough. The days following the storm were a blur of routine and preparation for the baby. Jack returned home and was appalled when he heard about the night I'd had. He wanted to confront his mother, but I asked him to let it go. The look on Margaret's face when she realized what she had put me through was enough for now. Over the next few weeks, Margaret's attitude seemed to shift. She called more often, not with demands, but to check on how I was feeling or to see if I needed help with anything. She even offered to accompany me to my prenatal appointments, an offer I hesitated to accept, but ultimately did. At one of these appointments, Margaret sat beside me in the waiting room. It was awkward at first, the silence between us filled with unspoken words. But then she reached over and took my hand. "Samantha, I want to apologize again for that night. I realize now how selfish I was. I was just so scared about losing Mr. Whiskers, but I didn't consider what I was asking of you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you, Margaret. It means a lot to hear you say that. I know we've had our differences, but I want us to be close for the baby's sake," I replied, squeezing her hand gently. From that moment on, our relationship began to change. Margaret was still the same strong-willed woman, but there was a new softness in her interactions with me. She helped us prepare the nursery, bringing over items from Jack's childhood and telling stories about his early years. One particularly stormy afternoon, reminiscent of that fateful night, Margaret and I sat in the nursery organizing baby clothes. The rain pounded against the windows and thunder rumbled in the distance, but this time the atmosphere inside was warm and comforting. "Jack used to love storms when he was a little boy," Margaret said, smiling at a memory. "He would sit by the window and watch the lightning, completely fascinated." "I hope our baby inherits that curiosity," I said, feeling a flutter of movement in my belly. "Though I could do without any storm-related adventures." Margaret laughed, a genuine warm sound that filled the room. "I think we've had enough of those for a lifetime." As my due date approached, Margaret became an invaluable support. She was there to help with last-minute preparations and to keep me company when Jack had to work late. Her presence was a source of comfort, a sign of how far our relationship had come. The night I went into labor, another storm was brewing. It seemed almost poetic, the way the thunder and lightning mirrored the intensity of the moment. Margaret was the first person we called to watch the house and take care of things while we rushed to the hospital. Hours later, as the storm raged outside, our daughter, Emily, was born. She was a tiny, perfect miracle, and as I held her in my arms, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude and love. Margaret arrived shortly after, her eyes filled with tears as she saw her granddaughter for the first time. She approached the bed, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch Emily's tiny fingers. "She's beautiful, Samantha," Margaret whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you, Margaret." "For everything," I replied, my own tears flowing freely. In that moment, all the past misunderstandings and conflicts seemed to fade away. We were a family, united by the love we had for this new life. The storm outside gradually subsided, giving way to a peaceful, quiet night. And inside, we found a new beginning, built on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding. As the days turned into weeks, Margaret remained a constant presence in Emily's life. She was there for the late-night feedings, the early morning diaper changes, and all the precious moments in between. Our relationship had been tested by the storm, but it had emerged stronger, forged in the crucible of shared experience and newfound empathy. Looking back, I realized that the night Margaret forced me to drive in the storm was a turning point. It was a night that could have driven us further apart, but instead brought us closer together. And for that, I was eternally grateful. When a severe storm hits, Samantha, 7 months pregnant, receives an urgent call from her demanding mother-in-law, Margaret, who insists she come over immediately. Forced to drive through the tempest, Samantha learns the emergency is a missing cat. Despite the perilous night, the shared experience begins to reshape their strained relationship. As they prepare for the baby's arrival, The storm becomes a turning point, forging a new bond of mutual respect and understanding between them. Storms of Understanding is a heartfelt tale of family, forgiveness, and the unexpected ways relationships can grow.